Buried across the ancient world, there is technology we simply cannot explain. Concrete that heals itself 3,000 years later. Glass that changes color completely depending on how the light hits it. Knowledge of space so precise it took us until the space age to independently verify it. And scattered among all of it, traces of ancient technology that stretch back further into the past than we can possibly imagine. Then there are the things that vanished entirely. A weapon that burned across the surface of the ocean, whose formula was so carefully guarded that it died with the empire that used it. Metals forged from meteorites using techniques nobody has ever explained, and machines appearing at a time when humanity was supposed to be made up of simple hunter-gatherers. The truth is, we tend to think of ourselves as the first civilization to truly figure it out. The most advanced, the most capable, the furthest along. But the more you look at what has been left behind, the harder that becomes to hold on to. Whatever came before us was far more advanced than we give it credit for, and some of what they knew, we still cannot explain today. Imagine a battlefield 2,000 years ago where a single blade could decide the fate of an empire. Across the ancient world, stories circulated of a metal so sharp it could slice through a falling silk veil, and so resilient it could shatter a standard iron broadsword without taking a notch. These weapons weren't just tools of war. They were considered almost supernatural objects, prized by Roman emperors and sought after by the high courts of Han China. This legendary material was Wootz steel. It represents a peak of ancient material science that remains one of history's most baffling technical anomalies. For over a millennium, the secret to its creation was the most valuable industrial secret on the planet, hidden away in the remote villages of the Indian subcontinent. The mystery of Wootz steel begins with its performance. In an era when most soldiers carried heavy, brittle iron blades that frequently bent or snapped in the heat of combat, the warriors of the Indian subcontinent possessed something entirely different. The Wootz blade offered a perfect marriage of opposites. It was hard enough to maintain a razor edge, yet flexible enough to absorb the shock of a cavalry charge. When polished, the surface of the metal revealed a distinctive swirling pattern that looked like flowing water or shifting sand. This water pattern was not a decorative etching or a surface treatment. It was the physical manifestation of the steel's internal crystalline structure, reaching all the way through the core of the blade. To understand who created this masterpiece, we have to travel back to at least the 6th century BC in the southern regions of India. The master smiths of the Chera, Chola, and Pandya dynasties developed a localized industrial complex that was centuries ahead of its time. These craftsmen were not simply blacksmiths. They were effectively the world's first chemical engineers. They operated in the Deccan Plateau and the regions of Tamil Nadu, turning the rugged landscape into a massive manufacturing hub. This was a state-sponsored industry that fueled a global trade network, with the steel serving as the primary high-value export that brought Roman gold and Mediterranean wine into Indian ports. The production process for a single Wootz button was an exercise in extreme patience and atmospheric control. The smiths used a crucible method that was fundamentally different from anything seen in Europe at the time. They would take high-purity iron ore and seal it inside small, hand-molded clay crucibles alongside specific organic materials, including wood and the leaves of the Cassia auriculata plant. Once sealed airtight with clay, these vessels were placed into a furnace and heated for several days. By sealing the crucible, the smiths created a pressurized, oxygen-free environment. This allowed the iron to slowly soak up carbon from the charred plant matter, transforming the raw ore into a high-carbon alloy with a precision that modern sensors find difficult to match. The role of the organic matter in these crucibles was recently illuminated by modern science, and the results were jarring for researchers. In the late 1990s, studies by metallurgists like John Verhoeven and Alfred Pendre used electron microscopy to peer into the heart of ancient Wootz samples. They discovered that these ancient smiths were inadvertently practicing nanotechnology. The specific leaves and wood used in the process acted as chemical catalysts, creating carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires within the steel. These microscopic structures gave the metal its legendary toughness. The South Indian smiths had found a way to manipulate the molecular architecture of steel over 2,000 years before we even knew what a molecule was. The reason this steel was so important comes down to the specialized military requirements of the time. The South Indian empires were naval and land superpowers that required weaponry capable of withstanding prolonged, high-intensity warfare. They developed weapons like the urumi, a flexible whipsword that required the steel to be coiled and snapped repeatedly. Only Wootz steel, with its nanostructure of hard carbides in a softer, flexible matrix, could survive that kind of mechanical stress. It gave their elite regiments an edge that was both psychological and physical, as their blades could effectively outlast the weapons of their enemies in a war of attrition. The global demand for this material eventually led to one of the most famous scientific failures in history. In the early 1800s, the British physicist Michael Faraday became obsessed with the rustless and shattering qualities of Indian steel. He was given original samples and attempted to replicate the process in his laboratory. Faraday was the man who pioneered our understanding of electromagnetism, yet he could not crack the code of the Wootz crucible. He suspected the secret lay in adding silica or aluminum, but his replicas lacked the characteristic water pattern and the internal strength of the originals. He eventually abandoned the project, leaving the steel as an unsolved mystery on his workbench. Verhoeven and Pendray eventually discovered why Faraday and so many others had failed. The secret wasn't just in the carbon or the heat, it was in the earth itself. The iron ore found in the Deccan Plateau contained natural, trace amounts of vanadium. This rare element acted as the essential seed that allowed the cementite nanowires to grow in parallel bands. Without that specific geological fingerprint, the traditional recipes were useless. The ancient smiths had developed a technology that was perfectly calibrated to the chemistry of their local soil. When those specific ore deposits began to run dry in the 19th century, the water pattern stopped appearing and the secret began to slip away. The final blow to the technology was political. As the British East India Company consolidated its grip on India, they recognized that local Wootz production was a threat to the industrial steel being imported from Britain. To protect their economic interests, they placed a ban on local smelting and forcibly dismantled the manufacturing networks in the South. Because the process was an oral tradition passed down through generations of master-apprentice lineages, the loss of active production meant the death of the knowledge. The men who could read the color of the fire and the sound of the cooling crucible died without passing on their feel for the metal. In the modern day, we can create modern alloys that are incredibly strong, but we still struggle to replicate the exact internal nanostructures of ancient Wootz using the same raw, traditional methods. We have the data to tell us what is inside the metal, but we have lost the intuitive mastery of the elements that allowed a village smith 2,000 years ago to forge a piece of nanotechnology. And so, the shimmering water pattern on a Wootz blade is the physical record of a peak of human genius that we are still trying to understand. In the southern desert of modern-day Jordan lies the city of Petra, a sprawling metropolis carved directly into red sandstone cliffs. Today, the site is famous for its ornate facades, but its existence was only possible because of a massive, invisible infrastructure that managed an extremely scarce resource. The Nabateans were originally a nomadic Arab people who settled in the region around the 4th century BC. They chose a location that appears strategically flawed for a permanent city, as the area receives less than 6 inches of annual rainfall. Despite this, Petra grew to house an estimated 30,000 people at its peak. The city did not just survive, it featured lush public gardens, massive open-air pools, and fountains that ran year-round. This was achieved through a sophisticated understanding of hydrology and gradient management that allowed them to harvest every drop of moisture from a vast surrounding drainage basin. The core of their technology was a network of over 800 hidden underground cisterns. These were not simple holes in the ground, but engineered chambers carved into the solid bedrock. To prevent the stored water from seeping into the porous sandstone or evaporating in the intense heat, the Nabateans developed a specialized waterproof plaster. Chemical analysis shows this plaster was based on a mixture of lime and volcanic ash, which created a durable hydraulic seal that actually hardened when exposed to water. By keeping the reservoirs underground and tightly sealed, they ensured the water remained cool and free from the bacteria that typically thrive in open desert pools. The logistics of moving this water into the city's center required a high level of mathematical precision. The Nabateans laid miles of terracotta pipes along the cliff faces, maintaining a steady downward gradient of exactly 4 degrees. This specific slope was a calculated choice. If the angle was too steep, the water pressure would increase to a point where it would burst the ceramic joints. If the angle was too shallow, the water would stagnate or fail to reach its destination. This level of gradient management allowed them to transport water from springs located over 5 miles away, delivering a constant supply to the heart of the city through gravity alone. Controlling water was the primary way the Nabateans secured their wealth. They sat at the crossroads of the most lucrative trade routes in the ancient world, specifically those for frankincense and myrrh. Caravan leaders traveling from southern Arabia to the Mediterranean had to pass through Nabatean territory. By providing reliable water and protection in a landscape where both were non-existent, the Nabateans created a strategic monopoly. They charged heavy taxes for passage and water rights, turning a nomadic tribe into one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the region. Recent technological advancements have revealed the true scale of this engineering. Surveys conducted by researchers such as T.S. Akashe and the Petra National Trust have mapped the surface ruins, but LIDAR scans have provided a look beneath the sand. These aerial scans using laser light revealed thousands of hidden channels, diversion dams, and terrace systems that the naked eye cannot see. These structures served a dual purpose. During the dry season, they channeled moisture into cisterns. During the infrequent but violent winter storms, they functioned as a flood control system. By breaking the momentum of flash floods through a series of small dams, the Nabateans protected their city from being washed away while simultaneously capturing the floodwater for later use. The fall of this water empire began with the Roman annexation in 106 AD. While the Romans were also excellent engineers, their arrival shifted the priorities of the region. The specialized labor force that the Nabateans had used for centuries to clean the terracotta pipes and maintain the silt traps was diverted to other imperial projects. Over time, these systems began to fail. Without constant desilting, the underground channels clogged. A series of major earthquakes in the 4th and 6th centuries AD eventually fractured the cisterns and broke the main aqueducts. Without the technical knowledge or the resources to repair the hidden infrastructure, the population dwindled, and the desert eventually reclaimed the city. In the 20th century, archaeologists and engineers began to realize that the ruins of Petra were more than just a graveyard of temples. Modern desert engineers now study the Nabatean methods to design sustainable water harvesting systems in arid regions. The Nabatean approach of small-scale, decentralized water collection is often more efficient in desert climates than modern large-scale dams, which lose massive amounts of water to evaporation. While we understand the physics behind their pipes and gradients, the sheer scale of their subterranean network remains an unmatched achievement in water conservation. The transition from the Nabateans' mastery of liquid water to the Roman mastery of solid architecture shows how engineering secrets could define an entire era. This leads us to the mystery of the Lycurgus cup, a piece of glass that manipulated light in a way that wouldn't be seen again for over 1,000 years. To the casual observer in a museum, it appears to be a well-crafted decorative object, but when the lighting changes, it demonstrates a physical property that wouldn't be seen again in the human record for over a millennium. The cup was produced during the middle of the 4th century AD, a period of significant cultural and religious transition in the Roman Empire. This was the era of the Constantinian dynasty, a time when the imperial court favored elaborate, cage cup-style vessels known as diatrata. These were the most expensive and technically difficult glass objects of the Roman world, featuring an outer decorative cage that was meticulously carved away from a single solid block of glass. The Lycurgus cup is the only complete example of such a vessel made from dichroic glass, marking it as a singular masterpiece likely commissioned for the highest levels of Roman society. The imagery carved into the glass is as intense as the science behind it. It depicts the mythical King Lycurgus of the Edoni in Thrace, who was being strangled by vines as a punishment for his hubris. According to the myth, Lycurgus had attacked the god, Dionysus, and one of his maenads, Ambrosia. In retaliation, the gods transformed Ambrosia into a grapevine that coiled around the king, trapping him. The choice of this specific scene was highly intentional. Because the cup was used for drinking wine, the transformation of the glass from green to a deep wine-red color served as a visual metaphor for the power of Dionysus and the very liquid the vessel was designed to hold. The most striking feature of the chalice remains its optical behavior. When the cup is lit from the front, it appears as a solid, opaque pea green. If a light source is placed inside the chalice or behind it, the glass undergoes a sudden change, turning a deep, translucent blood red. This effect was achieved through a process that baffled historians for decades. For a long time, researchers assumed the color shift was a chemical fluke or the result of a happy accident in the forge. It wasn't until the late 20th century that we had the tools necessary to look inside the glass and understand the physical reality of its construction. In 1990, researchers at the British Museum conducted a detailed study to determine exactly what was happening inside the glass matrix. A team led by Ian Freestone used a transmission electron microscope to examine microscopic fragments that had been removed from the cup during a previous restoration. They found that the glass was infused with a tiny amount of silver and gold particles. These metals weren't just mixed into the glass in a traditional sense, they were suspended as nanoparticles. The Roman artisans had ground these metals down to a size of 70 nanometers, which is roughly 1,000th the size of a grain of salt. The science behind this color change, known as surface plasmon resonance, is complex. When light hits these specific metal particles, the electrons on the surface of the gold and silver vibrate in a way that scatters shorter wavelengths of light, like blue and green. This is why the cup looks green when light reflects off the exterior. However, when light passes through the glass from the back, these same nanoparticles allow longer wavelengths, such as red, to pass through while blocking the others. This level of precision required the Romans to master a specific ratio of metals, approximately 330 parts per million of silver to 40 parts per million of gold. This exact balance suggests that the Romans were not simply tossing metal shavings into a vat. Instead, they had developed a highly controlled chemical process to ensure the particles were distributed evenly throughout the glass melt. If the particles were too large, or if the concentration was off by even a small margin, the dichroic effect would fail. The glass would simply appear muddy, opaque, or a singular, unchanging color. The consistency of the Lycurgus cup suggests the existence of a highly specialized guild of glassmakers who understood the exact heating and cooling cycles required to grow these nanoparticles within the glass. The artisans who created this were part of the specialized Roman glassmaking guilds that flourished during the late Empire. These guilds were often secretive, passing their recipes and techniques down through a master-apprentice system. The purpose of the cup was almost certainly a demonstration of imperial prestige. By using technology to mimic the color of wine and depict a myth about the god of wine, the Romans were showing their ability to manipulate the natural world for the pleasure of the elite. It was a demonstration of luxury that doubled as a high-stakes engineering feat, designed to impress guests at the most exclusive imperial banquets. The loss of this technology coincided with the broader fragmentation of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. As the imperial structure collapsed, the centralized glassmaking guilds began to break down. The specific supply chains for high-purity gold and silver, as well as the specialized knowledge required to grind them into nanoparticles, vanished as the economic centers of the Mediterranean shifted. Without a written record of the chemical recipe, the art of dichroic glassmaking was lost. The knowledge of nanometallurgy effectively disappeared from the historical record for nearly 1,600 years. Throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, glassmakers tried to replicate the ruby colors seen in ancient Roman artifacts, but they rarely achieved the same dichroic properties. They often used copper or different iron oxides, which produced a red glass, but it remained red regardless of the lighting direction. It wasn't until the late 19th century that chemists began to understand the role of colloidal metals in glass coloring, and even then, they lacked the ability to measure the particles at the nanoscale. In the late 20th century, scientists at NASA rediscovered a similar dichroic coating technology for use in satellite mirrors and astronaut helmet visors. These modern applications use thin layers of metal to reflect harmful radiation while allowing visible light to pass through, operating on the same physical principles found in the Lycurgus cup. While we can replicate the cup today using laboratory-grade equipment and computer-controlled heating, we cannot fully explain how the Romans achieved such molecular precision in a traditional workshop environment without modern chemical sensors or thermometers. The existence of the cup forces a reconsideration of the technical limits of the 4th century. It shows that ancient craftsmen were capable of performing what we now call material science, even if they described the process in different terms. They were not just shaping glass, they were engineering its interaction with light at a level that humanity would not reach again until the age of space exploration. The Lycurgus cup remains a physical record of a sophisticated technical peak that was reached, mastered, and then completely forgotten. While the engineers of the Song dynasty were using water to track the movements of the stars, the Byzantine Empire was using a different kind of liquid to protect the borders of their capital. This substance was Greek fire, a terrifying weapon that secured the survival of the Eastern Roman Empire for centuries. First appearing in the 7th century AD, Greek fire was a liquid that burned with intense heat and could not be put out by water. In fact, it actually continued to burn while floating on the ocean's surface. It functioned as the ultimate naval deterrent, allowing the Byzantine navy to incinerate enemy fleets before they could breach the walls of Constantinople. The history of this weapon is centered on a specific moment of crisis. In the year 673, a massive naval fleet launched an attack against Constantinople. The Byzantines were vastly outnumbered and appeared to be on the brink of collapse. According to historical records, a refugee named Callinicus of Heliopolis arrived in the city fleeing conflict in Syria. He presented the emperor with a new invention, a liquid fire that could be projected from ships. This was not a primitive fire arrow or a simple pot of burning oil. It was a sophisticated chemical weapon system that changed the nature of maritime warfare. The science of Greek fire involved two distinct components: the chemical mixture itself and the mechanical system used to deploy it. The delivery mechanism was a pressurized bronze pump known as a siphon. This functioned very much like a modern flamethrower. Byzantine engineers would heat the liquid in a sealed cauldron and then use a manual pump to force it through a bronze nozzle mounted on the front of the ship. The pressure allowed the Byzantines to spray a stream of fire over a distance of several dozen yards. Because the liquid was under pressure, it exited the nozzle with a loud, roaring sound that witnesses described as sounding like thunder. This mechanical part of the system required a high level of metalworking skill. The pumps had to be airtight and strong enough to handle both the heat of the boiling liquid and the pressure required to launch it. If the seals on the bronze pipes failed, the weapon was just as dangerous to the Byzantine sailors as it was to the enemy. This meant that every ship equipped with the device had to carry a specialized team of engineers who understood how to maintain the pressure and manage the volatile chemicals safely during the chaos of a sea battle. The chemical properties of the substance were specifically engineered for naval combat. Most fires of the era could be put out with a bucket of seawater, but Greek fire actually reacted to water with more intensity. It was described as a sticky fire, meaning it would cling to the wooden hulls of ships and the clothing of sailors. Once ignited, it was nearly impossible to remove. Historical accounts suggest that only 3 things could reliably put out the flames: large amounts of sand, strong vinegar, or human urine. These specific requirements point to a complex chemical makeup that modern researchers are still trying to categorize. In the 20th century, historians and chemists began to conduct serious forensic analysis on the surviving descriptions of the weapon. Researchers such as John Haldon and Maurice Byrne have focused on the chemical signatures mentioned in Byzantine texts. The leading theory is that the base of the mixture was crude oil, or naphtha, which was naturally available in the regions around the Black Sea. To this, the Byzantines likely added resins to make the liquid thick and sulfur to increase the heat of the flame. A more controversial part of the theory involves the use of quicklime. When quicklime comes into contact with water, it creates a chemical reaction that generates significant heat. If the Byzantines had found a way to suspend quicklime within the oil base, the act of spraying the liquid over the ocean would have triggered an automatic ignition as soon as the mixture hit the seawater. This would explain why the fire seemed to start on the water's surface. However, keeping such a mixture stable in a liquid form without it reacting too early in the tank would have required an advanced understanding of chemistry. The use of Greek fire was strictly controlled by the Byzantine government. The formula was considered a sacred secret that ensured the safety of the empire. Emperor Constantine VII went so far as to claim that the secret of the fire had been revealed to the first Emperor Constantine by an angel. He warned that any official who shared the secret would be struck down by divine lightning. This was not just religious talk. It was a way to maintain a strategic monopoly. The knowledge was so divided that no single person knew the entire process. One family might know how to refine the oil, another how to build the bronze pumps, and another how to mix the final additives. This extreme secrecy is the primary reason the technology was lost. The Byzantine structure was highly centralized, but as the empire began to break apart in the 11th and 12th centuries, these specialized groups of craftsmen were scattered. During the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Constantinople was attacked by Western Europeans, much of the city's infrastructure was destroyed. The secret was never written down in full, and as the specific families who held the different pieces of the formula died out, the ability to produce the weapon vanished. By the time the Ottoman Turks took the city in 1453, the Byzantines had lost the secret to their most effective weapon, leaving them to defend their walls without their famous fire. The impact of Greek fire on the map of the world cannot be overstated. For over 500 years, it acted as a technological wall that prevented various caliphates from expanding into Europe through the Mediterranean. Because the Byzantines could incinerate entire fleets, they held a naval supremacy that allowed their culture and administrative systems to survive far longer than they otherwise would have. The loss of the secret was not just a loss of a chemical recipe, it was the loss of the empire's primary insurance policy. Modern attempts to recreate Greek fire have been frequent, but largely unsuccessful. We can create liquids that burn on water, such as napalm, but these rely on modern synthetic materials and jellied gasoline. When researchers try to build a version using only 7th century materials like sulfur, oil, and resins, they struggle to replicate the sticky quality and the specific roaring combustion described in the texts. No modern recreation has perfectly matched the historical observation that the substance could burn underneath the water's surface, a feat that suggests a component within the mix that provided its own oxygen. The Polynesian voyage, sand, the reconstruction of Susong's clock, showed that we can often recover mechanical or navigational systems through trial and error. But Greek fire represents a chemical loss that is much harder to reverse. Without the exact ratios and the specific local sources of the raw materials, the true Greek fire remains a mystery. It stands as a unique example of a state secret so well kept that it successfully prevented both enemies and future generations from ever truly understanding it. Unlike modern concrete, which often begins to degrade after 50 to 100 years, Roman structures have remained sound for over 2 millennia. This longevity is especially evident in their maritime engineering, where ancient harbors have been submerged in salt water for 2,000 years and have actually grown stronger over time. Before the development of this volcanic mix, Mediterranean builders relied primarily on ashlar masonry, large hand-cut blocks of stone held together by gravity or simple lime mortars. This traditional method was extremely labor-intensive and limited the size of the structures that could be built. A wall made of cut stone is only as strong as the friction between the blocks. When the Romans introduced a pourable hydraulic concrete, it changed the fundamental logic of construction. Instead of stacking individual pieces, they could create a single monolithic mass of artificial stone. This allowed for the creation of vast interior spaces and massive vaults that were previously impossible to support using traditional brick or stone. For decades, engineers assumed that Roman concrete was simply a more primitive version of modern Portland cement. We thought the Romans were just fortunate to have access to high-quality raw materials. However, modern structures built in seawater often crumble as the salt corrodes the steel reinforcements and the water leaches away the binding agents. In contrast, Roman breakwaters and piers remain intact. This prompted a massive shift in how we view ancient civil engineering. Instead of a static material, Roman concrete is a reactive one that undergoes a continuous chemical evolution throughout its life. The core of this technology was a specific mixture of quicklime and volcanic ash, known as pozzolana. The Romans sourced this ash primarily from the region around the Bay of Naples, particularly near Mount Vesuvius. When these materials were mixed with water, a pozzolanic reaction occurred that created a durable, stone-like substance. But the true secret, which remained a mystery until very recently, was the method of mixing. For centuries, historians believed the Romans meticulously mixed their lime into a smooth paste before adding it to the ash. We now know this was incorrect. In 2023, a landmark study led by Admir Masick at MIT revealed a different process known as hot mixing. By analyzing microscopic samples of Roman concrete from the walls of Privernum, researchers found small white mineral chunks known as lime clasts. In the past, archaeologists dismissed these as evidence of poor mixing or low-quality materials. Masick's team discovered that these clasts were the result of mixing quicklime directly with the volcanic ash and water at extremely high temperatures. This hot mixing process created a material that was not chemically uniform, but instead contained these reactive reservoirs of calcium. These lime clasts provide the concrete with a self-healing capability. When a microscopic crack forms in a Roman wall due to seismic activity or the pounding of the sea, water seeps into the fissure. As the water hits a lime clast, it dissolves the calcium, creating a solution that quickly recrystallizes. This new mineral growth fills the crack and seals the structure, effectively repairing the damage from the inside out before it can lead to a major structural failure. This explains why the Pantheon, with its massive unreinforced concrete dome, has survived for centuries without collapsing under its own weight or crumbling from environmental stress. The military and civil engineers of the Roman Empire developed this system because they faced an urgent need for stable infrastructure across a vast territory. As Rome expanded, it required reliable deepwater ports to supply its legions and its growing urban populations. Traditional stone masonry was too slow and expensive for the scale of construction required. By using concrete, Roman engineers could cast massive structures in place. Even underwater, they used wooden forms to contain the mixture, which would cure and harden regardless of the presence of the sea, allowing them to build harbors where no natural protection existed. One of the most famous applications of this technology is the Pantheon in Rome, completed under Emperor Hadrian around 126 AD. The dome is a miracle of material weight management. At the base, the concrete is thick and mixed with heavy basalt aggregate to provide strength. As the dome rises toward the central opening, the engineers transitioned to lighter aggregates like porous pumice to reduce the weight. This tiered system of density allowed them to build a dome spanning over 43 meters without any internal support beams. Other notable structures include the baths of Caracalla and the markets of Trajan, which utilized massive concrete vaults to create a multi-level indoor shopping complex. The performance of this concrete in marine environments was further explored by the Ramacans project, an international research initiative that spent over a decade testing Roman-style concrete in various ocean conditions. They found that salt water actually acts as a catalyst for the concrete's strength. When seawater enters the concrete, it reacts with the volcanic ash to form a rare mineral called aluminous tobermorite. These crystals grow within the concrete over hundreds of years, interlacing through the material like a microscopic web. While modern concrete is eventually destroyed by the sea, Roman concrete uses the minerals in the water to weave itself together more tightly. The people behind this were the architecti and mensaries, the architects and surveyors of the Roman legions. They were highly mobile and carried their technical manuals from one end of the empire to the other. Their goal was standardized durability. They needed to know that a bridge built in Britain would be just as reliable as a temple in North Africa. The use of standardized recipes and the hot mixing technique allowed them to achieve a level of quality control that sustained the empire's infrastructure for centuries. The loss of this technology was not the result of a single event, but rather the collapse of the specialized supply chains that supported it. The key ingredient, pozzolana ash, had to be shipped in massive quantities from the Bay of Naples to construction sites across the Mediterranean. As the Western Roman Empire began to fracture in the 5th century AD, these maritime transport networks failed. Local builders lost access to the volcanic ash and the specialized quicklime required for hot mixing. Without the correct raw materials, they reverted to using simpler lime mortars, which lacked the hydraulic properties and self-healing triggers of the original Roman mix. As the technical knowledge of the architecti faded, the secret of Roman concrete became a legend. During the Middle Ages, builders looked at Roman ruins and believed they were the work of giants because they could not replicate the hardness of the stone. It took nearly 1,300 years for hydraulic cement to be rediscovered, and even then, the industrial versions we created focused on speed and strength in the short term, rather than the multi-generational durability of the Roman method. Modern researchers are now attempting to replicate this ancient chemical code to solve a contemporary crisis. The production of modern Portland cement is responsible for roughly 8% of global carbon dioxide emissions. By adopting the Roman approach of using volcanic ash and self-healing lime clasts, engineers hope to create a new generation of concrete that lasts longer and requires significantly less maintenance. If a building can last for 200 years instead of 50, the environmental cost of construction is drastically reduced. We have successfully cracked the chemical code of the lime class, but we still struggle to mass-produce this material as efficiently as the Romans did. Our modern construction industry is built on the standardization of Portland cement, and shifting back to a reactive, hot-mixed material requires a fundamental change in how we manufacture and transport building supplies. We can see the results of their genius in the piers of the Mediterranean, but rebuilding the industrial lineage that created them is a slow process of trial and error. While the builders of the Roman Empire were utilizing concrete to construct monuments that rose high above the ground, a different kind of engineering was already established beneath the soil of central Italy. Long before the first Roman aqueduct was ever conceived, a civilization known as the Etruscans had developed a sophisticated method of managing the landscape. They created a subterranean network of channels called cuniculi. These were not simple drains or sewers. They were a massive, integrated hydraulic system designed to control the water table across thousands of square miles of what is now Tuscany and Lazio. The Etruscans were a culture that emerged in the Iron Age, roughly around 900 BC, in the region of north-central Italy known as Etruria. While their origins remain a subject of debate among historians, their influence on the development of Western civilization is undeniable. They were a loose confederation of 12 independent city-states, each a regional power with its own king and government. Unlike the later centralized Roman Empire, the Etruscans functioned as a cultural and religious bloc, bound by a shared language that was entirely unrelated to the Latin spoken by their neighbors. They were a maritime people, controlling the Tyrrhenian Sea and trading extensively with the Greeks and Phoenicians. This contact with the wider Mediterranean world allowed them to import ideas in art, religion, and metallurgy, which they then adapted into a unique cultural identity. By the 7th century BC, the Etruscans had become one of the wealthiest and most technologically advanced societies in the Mediterranean. They were masters of bronze working and jewelry, but their most impressive achievements were in the field of land management. They lived in a landscape dominated by volcanic activity, where the earth was composed of tuff, a solidified volcanic ash. While this rock was easy to carve, the topography was difficult to farm. The Etruscans settled on high plateaus for defense, but the valleys below were prone to flooding and the formation of stagnant pools. To transform this difficult terrain into a productive heartland, they developed a level of hydraulic skill that was arguably more advanced than anything found in the contemporary Greek or Egyptian worlds. The discovery of the cuniculi reveals that the Etruscans were the primary architects of the Italian landscape before the rise of the Roman Republic. Living in city-states such as Veii, Caere, and Tarquinia, they realized that the key to urban growth was agricultural surplus. To achieve this, they began an ambitious project to drain the earth. By carving tunnels directly into the volcanic tuff, they could divert excess groundwater into nearby rivers. This was a form of passive engineering. They weren't pumping water, they were simply creating a new path for it to follow. This allowed them to reclaim thousands of acres of swampy valley floors, turning them into the most fertile grain-producing regions in Italy. The technical challenge of digging these tunnels was significant. To ensure that water flowed consistently without eroding the floor of the tunnel or stagnating, the Etruscans had to maintain a precise gradient. In many of the cuniculi surveyed around the ancient city of Veii, engineers managed to maintain a slope of exactly 1 degree over distances of several miles. Achieving this level of accuracy while working in complete darkness, hundreds of feet underground, required a rigorous application of basic physics and surveying. It suggests that the Etruscans possessed a specialized class of engineers who spent their lives mastering the behavior of water and the structural properties of volcanic rock. To stay on course, the Etruscan diggers utilized a system of vertical shafts known as pozzi. These were wells sunk from the surface down to the intended path of the tunnel at regular intervals, often spaced about 30 to 50 yards apart. These shafts provided essential ventilation for the workers and allowed for the efficient removal of excavated rock. However, their most important function was as a fixed reference point for surveying. By hanging plumb lines, simple lead weights on strings, down these vertical shafts, the workers could establish a vertical baseline. This allowed them to check their depth and direction against the surface terrain, ensuring that the tunnel didn't deviate into a hill or drop too sharply into a ravine. To maintain the horizontal direction and the specific 1 degree slope between two shafts, the diggers used fire sightings. They would place oil lamps in a straight row along the floor of the tunnel. By looking back toward the last shaft and lining up the flames, they could ensure the tunnel did not drift to the left or right. The gradient was likely checked using a water level. A common tool of the time was a long wooden trough filled with water. As long as the water remained a certain distance from the top of the trough at both ends, the workers knew they were maintaining their intended slope. This methodical process allowed teams digging from opposite ends to meet in the middle with a margin of error of only a few inches, a feat of coordination that required precise timing and communication between the surface and the subterranean teams. Our modern understanding of the sheer scale of this work began in the 1960s with the pioneering surveys of Sheldon Judson and Ann Kahane. They documented thousands of miles of these tunnels, many of which had been forgotten for over 2,000 years. In recent years, researchers have utilized LIDAR technology to map the tunnels more accurately. By using laser-equipped aircraft to scan the ground surface, they can detect the subtle depressions left by the vertical pozzi shafts, even when those shafts are hidden under thick forest or modern buildings. In the area around Veii alone, LIDAR has revealed a labyrinth of channels that shows the Etruscans were managing the water of an entire region as a single project. The Etruscans were not just digging for the sake of drainage. They were creating a sustainable environment. The cuniculi also served as a reliable source of water during the dry summer months. Because the tunnels were carved into porous tuff, they acted as a horizontal well, collecting the water that naturally filtered through the rock. This collected water was then used for irrigation and even urban consumption. This dual-purpose design, drainage in the winter and collection in the summer, is a testament to a holistic approach to civil engineering that balanced the needs of the city with the cycles of the seasons. The decline of this technology began with the rise of Rome. When the Roman Republic finally conquered the Etruscan city of Veii in 396 BC, they inherited the landscape, but failed to maintain the infrastructure beneath it. The cuniculi were not self-sustaining. They required regular manual labor to clear out the silt and debris that washed in during heavy rains. As the Romans focused their energy on building more visible monuments and expanding their borders through military conquest, the maintenance of the Etruscan tunnels was neglected. The Roman focus was on the grand and the public, often at the expense of the subtle, invisible systems that kept the land healthy. Within a few centuries, many of the tunnels became clogged with sediment. The water stopped flowing, and the valleys returned to their natural swampy state. This environmental change had a direct impact on the health of the region. The stagnant water in the neglected valleys became a breeding ground for mosquitoes, leading to the return of malaria. This disease became a chronic problem for the Roman countryside, recurring for centuries and significantly affecting the population and the economy of the empire. Historians often point to the Maremma marshes of Italy as a tragic example of what happens when a sophisticated drainage system is allowed to decay. The loss of the Etruscan hydraulic knowledge turned a productive garden into a biological hazard that would plague the Italian peninsula until the modern era. While the Romans eventually built their own aqueducts to bring fresh water into the city, those systems were designed for a different purpose. The Roman aqueducts carried water under pressure over long distances to supply public baths and fountains. In contrast, the Etruscan cuniculae were a form of passive environmental engineering designed to work with the natural water table. The Romans borrowed the concept of the posy shafts and the gradient techniques for their own projects, but they never quite matched the Etruscan focus on total landscape drainage. The Etruscans viewed the earth as something to be balanced, whereas the Romans viewed it as something to be conquered and reshaped. Today, engineers view the cuniculi as a significant achievement in sustainable land management. While we can now calculate these gradients using digital levels and laser guides, the fact that a civilization was able to achieve this through manual excavation and simple fire sightings is a testament to their observational skills. We understand the purpose of the tunnels, but the manual precision required to dig them with such accuracy without modern surveying equipment remains a point of interest for historians of technology. The cuniculi stand as a physical record of a civilization that changed the earth itself to suit its needs, only for that earth to reclaim itself once the technical knowledge was lost. While the engineers of central Italy were perfecting the drainage of the earth, the Maya of Central America were looking in the opposite direction. In the tropical lowlands of modern-day Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize, a civilization developed that viewed the movement of the heavens as the primary blueprint for human existence. The Maya were not just observers of the stars. They were obsessive mathematicians who tracked the cycles of the sun, moon, and planets with a level of precision that challenges our understanding of pre-telescopic science. Their technical legacy is recorded in massive stone monuments and a few surviving bark paper books that reveal a sophisticated grasp of orbital mechanics. The discovery of the depth of Mayan astronomy began with the analysis of the Dresden Codex, one of only 4 surviving Mayan books. Most of the Mayan libraries were destroyed during the Spanish conquest, but this specific document found its way to Europe in the 18th century. It contains complex tables tracking the movements of the planet Venus over several centuries. When researchers began to decode these inscriptions alongside the carvings on monuments at sites like Copan and Chichen Itza, They realized that the Maya were using a system of interlocking calendars to map time on both a human and a cosmic scale. The Mayan approach to time was defined by two primary cycles, the Tzolk'in and the Hab. The Tzolk'in was a 260-day ritual calendar, likely based on the human gestation period or the agricultural cycle of the highlands. The Hab was a 365-day solar calendar, similar to our own, though it did not utilize a leap year. Instead, these two cycles worked together like two meshing gears. Every 18,980 days, roughly 52 years, the two calendars would return to their original starting positions, a cycle known as the calendar round. This system allowed the Maya to manage the daily needs of their society, but for tracking the deep history of the universe, they developed the long count. The long count was a linear count of days that began at a fixed point in the distant past, specifically August 11th, 3114 BC. This calendar was based on a vigesimal, or base 20, numbering system. The Maya used units called kins, representing days, winals, representing 20 days, tuns, for 360 days, keatuns, for 7,200 days, and baktuns, for 144,000 days. By using this structure, they could record dates millions of years into the past or the future. It was this system that allowed them to perform the sophisticated astronomical calculations that have fascinated modern researchers. One of the most extraordinary achievements of Mayan science was their calculation of the Venus synodic cycle. The synodic cycle is the time it takes for Venus to return to the same position in the sky as seen from Earth. Modern measurements place this cycle at approximately 583.92 days. The Mayan priest astronomers, through centuries of naked-eye observation, calculated this as 584 days. To account for the fractional difference, they developed a correction system that was utilized over thousands of years. Recent analysis of their tables suggests they managed an error of only 1 day in 6,000 years. This level of orbital precision was achieved without the aid of telescopes, clocks, or even metal tools. The people responsible for these calculations were the Akin, the priest astronomers of the Mayan courts. They viewed time as a cyclical, divine force, where events of the past were expected to recur in the future if the cosmic conditions were the same. Their primary goal was to provide the ruling elite with perfect celestial alignments for political ceremonies, military campaigns, and agricultural planning. In the Mayan worldview, a king's legitimacy was tied to his ability to synchronize his actions with the movements of the gods, who were often personified by the planets. Venus, in particular, was associated with warfare, and its appearance as the morning star often dictated the timing of major raids or battles. Scientific study of these calendars was pioneered in the 20th century by researchers like J. Eric S. Thompson and later by Anthony Aveni, who is considered the father of modern archaeoastronomy. Thompson helped bridge the gap between Mayan glyphs and the Western calendar, while Aveni focused on the orientation of Mayan buildings. He discovered that many structures, such as the Caracol at Chichen Itza or the governor's palace at Uxmal, were precisely aligned to the rising and setting points of Venus at its most extreme positions on the horizon. These buildings were essentially stone instruments, designed to capture the movements of the heavens and record them for posterity. A significant breakthrough occurred in 2012 with the discovery of a small house in the ruins of Zultun, Guatemala. Inside, archaeologists found a room where the walls were covered in fine-line paintings and mathematical notations. Unlike the formal inscriptions on stone monuments, these appeared to be the actual worksheets of Mayan astronomers. The tables recorded the cycles of the Moon, Mars, and Venus, as well as the dates for future eclipses. This discovery provided a rare look at the active scribal process, showing that the Maya were constantly refining their data through observation and correction. The math used in these calculations was highly advanced. The Maya were one of the only ancient civilizations to independently discover the concept of zero, which they represented with a shell-like glyph. Their base 20 system used only 3 symbols: a dot for 1, a bar for 5, and the shell for 0. This simple notation allowed them to perform complex addition and subtraction and to manage the vast numbers required for the long count. The existence of these worksheets at Zultan suggests that Mayan astronomers were performing a type of data-driven science that would be recognizable to a modern researcher. The loss of this mathematical heritage was a direct result of the Spanish conquest in the 16th century. In 1562, at the town of Mani, a Franciscan friar named Diego de Landa ordered the burning of thousands of Mayan books. He viewed the codices as superstition and lies of the devil, and sought to erase the traditional knowledge of the Maya to aid in their conversion to Christianity. In a single afternoon, the vast majority of Mayan history, science, and mathematics was reduced to ash. While the calendars survived on the stone faces of monuments and in the memories of the people, the detailed records explaining how they performed their calculations were largely destroyed. Following the collapse of the classic Mayan civilization in the 9th century AD, many of the great cities were abandoned and reclaimed by the jungle. The specialized lineage of priest astronomers was broken, and much of the advanced mathematical knowledge faded. By the time the Spanish arrived, the Maya were still using the 260-day and 365-day calendars, but the deep time calculations of the long count had largely fallen out of use. The destruction of the books by De Landa ensured that the specific mathematical logic behind their precision remained a mystery for nearly 4 centuries. Modern attempts to replicate Mayan calculations have shown just how rigorous their methodology was. We can verify their data using supercomputers and satellite observations, confirming that their orbital tracks for the planets were incredibly accurate. However, we cannot fully explain how they achieved this without lenses or mechanical timekeepers. It appears they relied on a method of long-term averaging, where they recorded observations over hundreds of years and then calculated the median. This required a level of intergenerational record-keeping and patience that is rare in the history of science. The Mayan calendars stand as a testament to a civilization that viewed the universe as a complex, orderly machine. They were able to look at the chaotic movements of the planets and find the underlying mathematical rhythms. While their cities are now ruins, their calculations remain etched in stone, providing a record of a time when the human mind was able to map the solar system through observation alone. This focus on the heavens and the patterns of time was not unique to the Maya, but their level of mathematical rigor sets them apart from almost any other ancient culture. While the Maya were mapping the infinite cycles of the stars, a different kind of technological advancement was taking place in northern Europe. On the medieval battlefields of the 9th through the 11th centuries, a specific type of weapon began to appear that seemed to defy the metallurgical standards of its time. These were the Ulfberht swords. Roughly 170 of these blades have been discovered, scattered across Scandinavia and northern Europe, all distinguished by a single name stamped into the steel: Ulfberht. These swords were so superior to the standard weaponry of the era that they functioned as the high-tech military hardware of the Viking Age. To understand why these swords were such a departure from the norm, it is necessary to look at the state of European metallurgy during the early Middle Ages. Most blacksmiths of this era worked in small, localized forges serving a specific village or lord. They utilized bloomery furnaces, which were essentially clay chimneys filled with alternating layers of iron ore and charcoal. These furnaces could not reach the temperatures required to fully melt iron. Instead, they produced a bloom, a spongy, glowing mass of iron mixed with pockets of sand and stone, known as slag. The life of a medieval blacksmith was defined by the grueling task of refining this bloom. They had to hammer the glowing mass repeatedly to squeeze out the liquid slag, a process that was never 100% effective. Because the iron was never truly liquid, the carbon from the charcoal was unevenly distributed. This resulted in weapons that were either too soft and prone to bending, or too brittle and prone to shattering upon impact. To compensate for these weaknesses, smiths used pattern welding. They would twist together multiple rods of different iron grades, creating the characteristic serpent or herringbone patterns seen on many Viking-era blades. While beautiful and functional, these were complex workarounds for a fundamental lack of high-quality steel. The Ulfbert swords represented a complete break from this tradition. These blades were likely produced in the Frankish Empire, specifically in the Rhineland region of modern-day Germany. During the Carolingian era, the Franks were the superpower of Europe, possessing the most organized workshops and a growing understanding of industrial-scale production. While the swords were Frankish in origin, they became most famous in the hands of the Vikings. The Norsemen were the ultimate consumers of high-end military technology, and through both trade and raids, they acquired these superior blades. In the 9th century, the Rhineland was a hub of commerce and craft, where master smiths operated under strict regulations, and the Ulfbert name likely functioned as an early trademark of a specific high-output workshop. The mystery of the Ulfbert lies in the composition of the metal itself. In contrast to the patterned blades of the era, the true Ulfbert swords were made of high-carbon crucible steel. This material was characterized by a consistent purity and a carbon content nearly 3 times higher than any other European blade of the time. Crucible steel requires the iron to be heated to approximately 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, the iron becomes completely liquid, allowing the slag to float to the top and be skimmed away. This process results in a steel that is virtually free of the internal weaknesses that cause standard swords to shatter against shields. For 1,000 years, historians believed that European technology was incapable of reaching these temperatures until the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s. The metallurgical analysis conducted by Dr. Alan Williams has been central to understanding this anomaly. By examining the microscopic structure of Ulfbert samples, Williams found that the steel was remarkably homogeneous. This level of purity meant the sword could be made thinner, lighter, and much more flexible than a pattern-welded blade. For a Viking warrior, this was a matter of life and death. A standard sword might fail after hitting a heavy wooden shield, but an Ulfbert could flex and return to its original shape, maintaining a razor-sharp edge through an entire campaign. This allowed for a faster, more agile style of combat that was simply not possible with heavier, more cumbersome iron weapons. Because of their immense cost and superior performance, these swords were utilized by the highest-ranking warriors and members of the elite. They were status symbols that functioned much like a luxury brand in the modern sense. However, the prestige of the name led to an early form of industrial espionage and counterfeiting. Many of the surviving Ulfbert swords are actually lower-quality fakes made of standard bloomery iron with the name misspelled or other variations. The true crucible steel blades, however, remained in a class of their own, likely produced in the Frankish Rhineland before being traded into Scandinavia. The how behind the production of these swords was explored in a notable PBS Nova documentary. Modern blacksmiths attempted to recreate an Ulfbert, using only the tools and materials available in the 9th century. They found that even with expert knowledge, the process of building a furnace capable of reaching and sustaining 3,000 degrees was a significant challenge. The experiment highlighted that the ancient smiths must have possessed a specialized understanding of airflow and fuel types, specifically the use of charcoal and bone, to reach the melting point of iron. Bone, interestingly, could have provided the necessary carbon and phosphorus to help purify the steel, suggesting that the smiths may have even used ritualistic elements like the bones of ancestors or animals to strengthen the metal. A major theory regarding the source of this steel involves the trade routes established by the Vikings. While the swords were likely forged in Europe, the raw crucible steel may have originated in Central Asia. During the height of the Viking Age, the Volga trade route connected Scandinavia to the Islamic world, where the production of wootz steel was already established. It is theorized that the Vikings traded furs, wax, and slaves for small ingots of high-carbon steel from places like modern-day Turkmenistan or Afghanistan. These ingots were then transported back to Europe and forged into the Ulfbert blades by Frankish master smiths. The loss of this technology coincided with the severing of these eastern trade routes in the 11th century. As political shifts and conflicts disrupted the flow of goods along the Volga and the Caspian Sea, the supply of high-carbon crucible steel from Central Asia dried up. Without the raw material, European smiths were unable to produce the Ulfbert quality blades. They had the blacksmithing skills to shape the metal, but they lacked the geological or chemical knowledge to manufacture the steel itself from local European ores. As a result, metallurgy in Northern Europe reverted to the inferior pattern welding method for nearly 800 years. This sudden drop in quality is visible in the archaeological record. The swords produced after the 11th century began to show higher levels of slag and a return to the sandwiching of different iron grades to achieve strength. The secret of the crucible steel vanished because it was a technology dependent on a specific global supply chain rather than a localized invention. The Ulfbert was a globalized product, and once the connection between the source and the forge was broken, the technology died with it. It would not be until the development of the Bessemer process in the 19th century that Europe would again consistently produce steel of this purity. Modern smiths have successfully made replicas of the Ulfbert that match the strength and purity of the originals, but they almost always rely on modern temperature-controlled furnaces. Recreating the blade from scratch using only raw ore and a charcoal fire remains a feat that requires a level of intuition regarding the behavior of the molten metal that we struggle to replicate. We understand the chemistry of why the swords were better, but we are still piecing together the exact setup of the ancient forges that allowed these results to be achieved on a consistent basis. The transition from the forged steel of the Vikings to the massive iron casting of ancient India reveals another instance where metallurgy reached a peak that left modern observers baffled. While the Vikings were mastering the portable power of the sword, engineers in Delhi were creating a massive monument that has survived for over 1,600 years without a single speck of rust. Standing 23 feet tall in the Qutb complex of Delhi, the iron pillar is a 6-ton testament to the advanced chemical knowledge of the Gupta Empire. To the tourists who visit the site today, it looks like a simple, dark metallic column. But to material scientists, it is a metallurgical anomaly that has defied the natural process of corrosion for more than a millennium. The pillar was commissioned by Chandragupta II, one of the most powerful emperors of the Gupta dynasty during the 4th century AD. This was the Golden Age of India, a period defined by massive advancements in mathematics, astronomy, and chemistry. Originally intended as a dhvaja, or standard, for the god Vishnu, the pillar was likely placed at a temple complex in Udayagiri before being moved to its current location in Delhi centuries later. It was built as a victory monument, intended to stand as a permanent record of the emperor's triumphs. At the time, iron was a difficult material to work with on such a large scale, and the creation of a 6-ton, solid iron column was a feat of engineering that wouldn't be matched in Europe for another 1,000 years. The primary mystery surrounding the pillar is why it hasn't rusted away. In the humid, monsoonal climate of Delhi, an iron object of this size should have disintegrated into a pile of red dust centuries ago. For a long time, researchers speculated that the iron might be of an extraterrestrial origin or possessed some magical purity. It wasn't until the late 20th century that scientific analysis provided a more grounded explanation. The rustlessness of the pillar is not due to the purity of the iron, but rather a specific chemical reaction occurring on its surface. Detailed studies conducted by R. Balasubramaniam from the Indian Institute of Technology have decoded the science of this protective layer. He found that the pillar is made of a specific type of wrought iron with an unusually high phosphorus content. In modern steelmaking, phosphorus is usually removed because it makes the metal brittle and difficult to weld. However, the ancient Indian smiths utilized iron ore that was naturally rich in phosphorus and chose not to remove it during the smelting process. This high phosphorus level, combined with the way the iron was forged, created a passive film on the surface of the pillar. This protective layer is composed of a complex mineral called misawite. When the iron was first exposed to the air and the humidity of the Indian climate, a thin layer of iron oxide, standard rust, began to form. However, because of the phosphorus in the metal, this rust didn't continue to eat into the core of the pillar. Instead, the phosphorus acted as a catalyst, transforming the rust into a dense, amorphous layer of iron hydrogen phosphate. This misawite film is only about 1/20th of a millimeter thick, but it is incredibly stable and completely airtight. It effectively seals the iron off from the environment, preventing oxygen and moisture from reaching the metal underneath. The manufacturing process itself was a masterpiece of forge welding. The pillar was not cast in a single mold. Instead, it was built up layer by layer. Indian smiths used a technique where small lumps of glowing, hot iron were hammered together into a solid mass. You can still see the hammer marks on the surface of the pillar where these individual pieces were fused. This method ensured that the impurities, mostly slag, were squeezed out and that the phosphorus was distributed evenly throughout the structure. It was a labor-intensive process that required hundreds of workers to coordinate their movements around a massive, white-hot mass of metal. The Gupta Empire supported this level of specialized labor because their society was built on the integration of science and religion. The Rasa Shastra, or the ancient Indian science of minerals and metals, was a highly developed field. Practitioners of this science were not just blacksmiths. They were early chemists who understood how different ores and fuel sources affected the final product. They utilized charcoal-based smelting, which allowed for a slower, more controlled chemical exchange between the fuel and the metal. This was the foundation of Indian metallurgy, which was renowned throughout the ancient world for producing some of the finest iron and steel in existence. The study of the iron pillar reached a turning point with the work of Balasubramaniam, who proved that the durability of the pillar was a deliberate result of the ancient smelting technique. He demonstrated that the ancient Indians had essentially created a self-healing material. If the surface of the pillar is scratched or chipped, the exposed iron simply reacts with the air to grow a new layer of misawite. This is a level of environmental adaptation that modern metallurgical engineers are still trying to fully replicate in sustainable ways. The loss of this specific technology occurred during the 19th century with the arrival of the Industrial Revolution in India. As the British colonial administration introduced modern coal-based smelting, the traditional charcoal-based methods began to disappear. Coal-based smelting is much faster and produces larger quantities of iron, but it introduces different impurities, specifically sulfur, into the metal. Sulfur interferes with the formation of the protective misawite layer. As the specialized knowledge of the ancient smelting guilds died out, the ability to produce rustless iron on this scale was lost to the drive for industrial speed and volume. The transition from charcoal to coal changed the chemistry of Indian iron permanently. The older wrought iron was replaced by mass-produced cast iron and steel, which, while stronger in tension, lacked the unique corrosion resistance of the Gupta-era metal. The traditional smiths were no longer commissioned for massive public monuments, and their technical manuals were often oral traditions that were not fully recorded. By the mid-20th century, the specific recipe for creating the phosphorus-rich passive film was effectively gone, replaced by modern galvanization and chemical coatings that require constant maintenance. Famous buildings and monuments across India utilize this iron technology, including the massive iron beams found in the Konark Sun Temple and the temple at Puri. These structures used iron as a structural reinforcement, allowing for much larger stone spans than would be possible otherwise. In these coastal environments, where salt air is a constant threat, the rustless iron was essential. The fact that these beams have survived the salty air for 800 years is another testament to the consistency of this metallurgical tradition before its eventual decline. In the modern era, we can create various rust-resistant alloys, such as stainless steel, by adding large amounts of chromium and nickel. However, these are expensive and energy-intensive to produce. The iron pillar represents a different approach, a simple wrought iron that uses its own internal chemistry to protect itself. We can replicate the chemical signature today, but we struggle to replicate the longevity of this specific material without using modern additives. The pillar remains a physical record of a time when Indian metallurgy was the most advanced in the world, utilizing the natural properties of the earth to create something that seems to exist outside of time. From the chemical mastery of Indian iron to the monumental engineering of the Andes, we see the different ways ancient civilizations solved the problem of permanence. While the metallurgists in Delhi were manipulating the molecular structure of metal to prevent rust, the Inca were manipulating the very foundations of the earth to withstand the violence of the tectonic plates. High above the city of Cusco, in modern-day Peru, lies Sacsayhuaman, a massive citadel that features some of the largest and most precisely fitted stone blocks in human history. To the Spanish conquistadors who first saw it in the 16th century, the site was so inexplicable that they believed it must have been constructed by demons rather than men. The discovery of the sheer scale of Sacsayhuaman reveals a level of logistical coordination that was unmatched in the pre-Columbian Americas. The site is defined by 3 parallel zigzag walls, each stretching over 400 meters. These walls are composed of limestone blocks, some of which are over 9 meters tall and weigh as much as 120 tons. Despite their immense size and irregular polygonal shapes, these stones fit together with such precision that a single blade of grass cannot be inserted between the joints. This was achieved without the use of mortar, iron tools, or even the wheel, making it a masterpiece of mechanical engineering, as well as the largest structure ever attempted in the pre-Columbian Americas. To understand the scale of this achievement, we must look at the rapid evolution of the Inca people. Originally a small tribe in the Cusco Valley, the Inca transformed into the largest empire in the Western Hemisphere in just under a century. Before the mid-15th century, their building style was far more modest, consisting primarily of fieldstones held together with mud mortar. However, as they expanded, they developed a religious and political obsession with stone. For the Inca, stone was a living, sacred material. They believed that by precisely shaping and joining rocks without the use of mortar, they were creating a divine harmony between human labor and the natural world. This shift in style coincided with the reign of Pachacuti, the 9th Sapa Inca. Under his guidance, the Inca moved away from simple Pirca masonry, rough stone and mud, to the imperial style we see at Sacsayhuaman. This advancement wasn't just about aesthetics, it was a psychological tool of empire. By moving boulders that weighed as much as 120 tons, the Inca state demonstrated its absolute control over both the environment and its population. They continued to advance this technology by experimenting with different types of rock, from soft limestone to incredibly hard andesite, developing specific tools and techniques for each. The mobilization required for these mass-building projects was supported by the MITA system, a form of mandatory public service. Every healthy male citizen was required to contribute labor to state projects for a set number of months each year. This wasn't seen as slavery, but as a reciprocal relationship. The state provided food, chicha beer, and protection, and in return, the people provided the muscle to build the empire's infrastructure. At Sacsayhuaman, it is estimated that 20,000 men worked in constant shifts. Some were specialists, architects, master masons, and rope makers, while the majority provided the raw power needed to pull the stones from the quarries. The how of this mobilization is found in the Inca's mastery of the terrain. To transport a 100-ton block, they built massive, gently sloping ramps made of compacted earth and gravel. They used thousands of feet of thick fiber ropes, woven from the tough grass of the high Andes, and lubricated the ramps with wet clay or round river stones to act as primitive ball bearings. It was a victory of coordination. Foremen used rhythmic chanting and whistles to ensure that hundreds of men pulled at the exact same moment, creating the sudden bursts of kinetic energy required to overcome the static friction of a limestone monolith. The zigzag walls of the site were built for several reasons. Strategically, the zigzag shape was a defensive masterpiece. It allowed defenders to rain projectiles onto the flanks of any attacking force. Politically, it served as a ceremonial center for the festival of Inti Raymi, dedicated to the sun god. But on a deeper level, it was built to prove that the Inca were the masters of the mountains. They weren't just building a fortress. They were literally reshaping the side of a mountain to match their imperial vision. The science of Inca masonry is centered on the concept of polygonal masonry and three-dimensional interlocking. Unlike the rectangular bricks used in Western architecture, the Inca shaped their stones into complex, multi-sided shapes. Each stone was custom-fitted to the ones surrounding it, creating a jigsaw-like structure. This design was a highly advanced seismic technology. The Andes are one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. When an earthquake hits, the stones of an Inca wall are designed to dance. They shift and vibrate in place, absorbing the energy of the tremor, and then settle back into their original positions once the shaking stops. While the Spanish colonial buildings in Cusco have collapsed repeatedly due to earthquakes, the walls of Sacsayhuaman have remained unmoved for 6 centuries. The method of how these stones were shaped remained a mystery for centuries, leading to theories about stone softening techniques. However, the work of researcher Jean-Pierre Protzen in the 1980s provided a more grounded explanation. Through experimental archaeology, Protzen demonstrated that the limestone could be shaped using hammerstones, harder river rocks like olivine basalt. By repeatedly pounding the limestone, a mason could peel away the surface until the desired shape was achieved. Protzen showed that a skilled worker could create a perfectly flat surface or a complex curve using only these simple tools. However, Protzen's experiments also highlighted the limitations of our understanding. While we know the stones were shaped this way, we are still debating how they were custom-fitted with such precision at such a massive scale. To fit a 100-ton block against its neighbor, the stone would have had to be moved, checked, carved, and moved again multiple times. The logistics of lifting and lowering these blocks to achieve a zero-gap fit is a feat of coordination that modern engineers still find difficult to conceptualize without the use of hydraulic cranes. The loss of this incredible technology began with the Spanish conquest in the 1530s. When Francisco Pizarro and his men captured Cusco, they were stunned by the architecture, but they viewed the site as a military threat. The specialized class of Inca architects and master masons, who held the oral traditions of stone listening, were among the first to be targeted or executed during the collapse of the imperial administration. Without the mita system to organize the labor and the master mages of stone to guide the construction, the knowledge of how to maintain and build these walls died within a single generation. The Spanish eventually used Sacsayhuaman as a quarry for their own construction projects in Cusco. They dismantled the upper, smaller tiers of the walls to build cathedrals, government buildings, and private mansions. However, when they reached the lower levels of the zigzag walls, they were forced to stop. The blocks were simply too large for the Spanish to move or destroy using their 16th century technology. They left the massive limestone monoliths in place, not out of respect for the Inca achievement, but because they lacked the mechanical means to displace them. The ruins we see today are essentially the unmovable remains of a much larger complex. In the modern era, we can replicate the look of Inca masonry using diamond-tipped saws and heavy-duty cranes, but we still struggle to replicate the efficiency and environmental integration of the original system. Modern masonry relies on standardization and speed, whereas the Inca utilized the unique geometry of every individual stone. Recent studies using LiDAR and 3D modeling have shown that the entire hill of Sacsayhuaman was reshaped by the Inca, with hidden drainage systems and subterranean chambers that are only now being mapped. We understand the math behind the polygonal joints, but the logistics of the trial and error fitting process at a 100-ton scale remains one of the greatest enigmas of ancient engineering. While the builders of the Roman Empire were using their industrial might to tame the hardest rocks on Earth, a group of Greek engineers was using their understanding of physics to build something entirely different. They created a device that compressed the entire movement of the solar system into a bronze box no larger than a shoebox. This was the Antikythera mechanism, an object so advanced that it challenges our traditional timeline of human progress. For nearly 2,000 years, this device lay hidden in the deep waters of the Aegean Sea, until a chance discovery by sponge divers changed our understanding of ancient science. In the year 1900, a group of divers seeking shelter from a storm anchored their boat near the small island of Antikythera. While exploring the seabed at a depth of about 45 meters, they discovered the remains of a massive Roman cargo ship that had sunk in the 1st century BC. Among the marble statues and bronze artifacts recovered from the site was a corroded, calcified lump of bronze that appeared to be of little value. It sat in a museum storage facility for 2 years, before it began to dry out and split open. This revealed the unmistakable outlines of gear teeth and complex internal mechanisms, sparking a century of scientific debate. The internal structure of the device consists of at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, each carved with microscopic precision. These gears were not designed to tell the time in the modern sense, but rather to calculate the movements of the heavens. By turning a single hand crank on the side of the wooden case, the user could move the entire system forward or backward in time. This input would trigger a series of mathematical outputs on several dials, showing the position of the sun, the phases of the moon, and the movements of the 5 planets known to the ancients. The most sophisticated aspect of the mechanical design is the use of differential gearing. This is a system that allows 2 different speeds to be combined into a single output, a concept that modern engineers once thought was not invented until the 16th century. The Greeks used this to account for the moon's complex motion across the sky. Because the moon's orbit is elliptical, it appears to move faster or slower at different times. The engineers achieved this by using a pin and slot mechanism where one gear sits slightly off-center on another, creating a variable speed that mimics the lunar cycle. On the back of the device, 2 large spiral dials tracked longer cycles, including the Saros cycle used to predict solar and lunar eclipses. The mechanism was so accurate that it could tell the user not only when an eclipse would happen, but the specific time of day, and even the color of the moon during the event. It also featured a small dial to track the 4-year cycle of the Pan-Hellenic Games, ensuring that the Olympic festivals were accurately scheduled. This integration of social, religious, and astronomical data suggests the device was a comprehensive cultural tool used by the Greek elite. The device is believed to have been built around the 2nd century BC, a period when Greek mathematics and mechanics reached a specific height. While we do not know the name of the exact maker, scholars often point to the island of Rhodes as its likely origin. Rhodes was a major center for astronomical study and was home to Hipparchus, one of the greatest astronomers of antiquity. Some researchers also believe the device represents a tradition of mechanical building started by Archimedes of Syracuse, who was known to have constructed spheres that demonstrated the movements of the planets. The technical height of the 2nd century BC was a time of intense intellectual curiosity in the Mediterranean. Scientists were beginning to apply geometry to the physical world, creating instruments that could measure the circumference of the Earth or the distance to the moon. The Antikythera mechanism was the peak of this movement, a physical proof that the universe followed mathematical laws. It wasn't just a toy for the wealthy. It was a functioning analog computer that allowed a traveler to carry the secrets of the solar system in their hand. For decades, the true complexity of the Antikythera mechanism remained hidden under layers of corrosion and sea crust. In the 1950s, historian Derek de Sola Price began the first serious scientific study using X-ray photography. He was the first to realize that the device was a complex astronomical computer rather than a simple astrolabe. His work was revolutionary, but the technology of the time could not see through the dense bronze to map the internal gear arrangement completely. Price's research provided the first skeletal model of the system, but many of the internal planetary gears remained a mystery. In the early 21st century, the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, led by Tony Freeth and Mike Edmonds, utilized advanced microfocus X-ray tomography. This allowed them to look inside the fragments in 3 dimensions, revealing thousands of tiny Greek characters inscribed on the interior surfaces. These inscriptions functioned as a user manual, explaining how the different dials worked and what the various astronomical symbols represented. This breakthrough confirmed that the device featured cycles for all 5 planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The inscriptions found on the device were not just labels, but a complex set of instructions. They described the heliacal risings and settings of stars, which are the moments when a star first becomes visible in the morning light or disappears in the evening. This data was essential for farmers and sailors who used the stars to track the seasons and navigate the seas. The text also mentions the color of eclipses, which was believed to have astrological significance in the ancient world. This indicates that the device was a deeply integrated part of how the Greeks understood their place in the cosmos. The shipwreck at Antikythera was likely a vessel carrying looted Greek treasures back to Rome to satisfy the growing demand for Greek culture among the Roman elite. The presence of so many high-value items suggests that the ship was part of a major operation to transport Greek heritage to the Roman capital. The cargo included fine pottery, glassware, and even large quantities of luxury food items, indicating that the Roman appetite for Greek refinement was driving a massive maritime industry. When the ship foundered in the deep waters of the Aegean, it took with it the only surviving example of this level of mechanical engineering. It is a sobering realization that if the divers had not found this specific wreck, we might never have known that the Greeks were capable of building gears this small or this complex. The historical record for the next 1,500 years shows a complete absence of any mechanical devices that come close to matching the Antikythera mechanism. While the Middle Ages produced sophisticated clocks, they did not utilize the differential gearing or the planetary math found in this ancient bronze box. The secret of the Greek computer was literally buried at the bottom of the sea. The disappearance of this technology is often attributed to the shifting priorities of the Mediterranean world. As the Roman Republic transitioned into the empire, the high-level theoretical mathematics of the Greeks were often replaced by the more practical engineering of the Romans. The specialized workshops that could produce bronze gears with the necessary precision to track an elliptical orbit likely died out as the demand shifted away from astronomical models. By the time the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the knowledge required to even understand how such a machine functioned was almost entirely gone. Modern watchmakers and scientists have built several functioning replicas of the mechanism, but the process has highlighted the sheer difficulty of the original build. To reach the necessary level of precision, modern builders typically use computer-controlled milling machines and high-tensile alloys. The Greeks, however, were working with hand tools and cast bronze. They had to hand-cut the triangular teeth of each gear, ensuring that they were perfectly uniform so the system would not jam. This required a level of manual dexterity and mathematical intuition that is extremely rare even among modern master craftsmen. Tony Freeth's team used a specialized 8-ton X-ray machine to scan the fragments, which allowed them to see through the bronze in slices only a few microns thick. They discovered that the main drive wheel had a complex set of 4 gears attached to its back, which they had previously missed. These gears were responsible for the planetary cycles. This discovery was the final piece of the puzzle that allowed researchers to build a complete model of the device that accounts for every dial and inscription found on the original fragments. The study of the Antikythera mechanism has forced us to reconsider the technological status of the ancient world. It shows that the Greeks had solved the problem of transforming mathematical theory into physical hardware long before the scientific revolution. The device was a bridge between the abstract geometry of the stars and the practical needs of navigation and timekeeping. It represents a peak of human ingenuity that was reached, mastered, and then left behind as the civilizations of antiquity transitioned into the medieval era. The shipwreck itself is still being explored by archaeologists today using modern diving equipment and robotic submersibles. Every year, new artifacts are brought to the surface, each one adding a new layer of detail to our understanding of the ship's final journey. While no other mechanism has been found, the search continues for fragments of the wooden case or other bronze components that might have been scattered across the seabed. The site remains one of the most important underwater archaeological locations in the world. When we look at the Antikythera mechanism alongside the other technologies we have explored, a pattern of brilliance and loss becomes clear. From the self-healing concrete of Rome to the high-carbon steel of the Vikings, human history is full of these technical heights. These breakthroughs were not just lucky accidents. They were the result of specialized knowledge and organized effort. By understanding how the Greeks built a computer without electricity, or how the Persians cooled their homes without power, we can find new ways to solve the challenges of our own time. These ancient technologies remind us that innovation is not always about the newest material or the fastest processor. Sometimes, the most sophisticated solution is the one that utilizes the fundamental laws of nature in the most elegant way.